Welcome back. In the last tutorial, we looked at what a compressor is, how it behaves, what it does to audio. In this tutorial, we're going to look at the functions available on a compressor, the different parameters, and what each one does. I have a number of compressors here that I can use. The simplest in terms of the visual representation is FabFilter's Pro C. I'm not going to use C2 because that's a little bit more complex. This is as simple as it gets. There is also a couple of others that I think are well worth looking at, and they are PSB's bus compressor is lovely, and Tony makes wonderful products, and to be honest, I have just about everything he's made. There we go. I love Antoni's products, and they're very, very cost effective. Let's start off with the FabFilter Pro C. And because the audio is in mono, and we can see it here, we need to use the mono. And for that, I'm going to use the sidechain version because we need to talk about what a sidechain is. Okay, audio is fed into the compressor, and it goes from here and outputs from this section. So this will be your input section. This will be all the processing, and most compressors, in fact all compressors, are based on this basic design of threshold, ratio, attack, release, input, output. We also have what we call gain compensation. We saw in the last video what happened when we compressed an audio signal. It became quieter, simply because we hadn't gain compensated to bring the levels back up. You can either do it automatically or manually. Okay, let's look at how everything behaves. And the best way to show you that is from one of my books where I've drawn diagrams. So we have the input, which is here. The threshold, so this is your audio. Output, which will be measured in decibels. The threshold is at which point we want the compressor to start. So imagine this is all filled up with audio, sound. I select the threshold and decide where I want to place it in that audio. And above the threshold, I'm going to compress to bring the levels or the peaks down above the threshold. We spoke about this in the last video, how a compressor behaves in terms of what it's actually doing to the audio. And now you can physically see, I know it's a graph and graphs can throw people off, but you can physically see what we're talking about. I find these kind of graphs or drawings very, very nice because they are so easy to follow. Input, and don't try and go mad over the X and Y axis. Just think of it like this. That's your audio. That's where you select the threshold. So think about the audio climbing in level, up and down. With compression, what we're doing is applying the compression once we've reached the threshold, not before. And I'm actually talking about downward compression now. Downward compression is the old traditional form of compression whereby we bring the peaks. We could use RMS mode, but that's going to be covered in the more advanced sections. And in peak mode, we are actually compressing the peak transients above the threshold. With no compression, you can see the audio goes right through. That's this line here. With a 3:1 ratio, you can see what happens when we get to this point here on the threshold. Suddenly we apply 3:1. In the last video, I explained to you what the ratios actually mean. If I have 3 dBs of audio, and remember we're talking about compressing above the threshold, and I use a 3:1 ratio, so for every 3 dBs that goes in here, 1 dB comes out. If you think of this as the new shape of our audio, you'll see how much we've brought it down from the no compressed signal. And this is using what we call a hardening. I'll come on to hardening a little later because With a soft knee, the behavior of the compressor is slightly different. Going back to the Pro C, our input, which was the x-axis in the diagram, the threshold, which we set based on which peaks we want to tame, so to speak, or compress. The ratio is by what amount, and this is a ratio. And a ratio can easily be explained as a division or a multiplication, depending on which way you want to go. Attack is we determine at what point we want the compressor to come in once it's reached the threshold. So if I pick a higher attack value, and let me show you here, means more of this signal will go through before the compressor starts to activate. As a very quick example, and we'll do it with the drums in a minute, if I pick a higher attack value here, I'm letting in more of my peak transients. Why? Because the attack is later. So we reach the threshold, and 6.55 milliseconds later, the compressor decides to activate. I am being very simplistic. That's really not how it works. Attacks, if we had to be pedantic and anal, are a rate. And the rate is based on how much of the audio is processed. In most cases, it's around 75% or so prior to the attack kicking in. For our purposes and for this tutorial, as it's a basic tutorial, just think of the attack as at what point does the compressor start to trigger in. Release, self-explanatory. We decide where we want the release value, or rather the compressor, to stop compressing and go back to the attack. Think of it like this: 6.55 milliseconds later, the compressor kicks in. 336.7 milliseconds later, the compressor releases itself, or kicks out, or stops, whatever you want to call it. If we're using complicated material, where there are a lot of transients and a lot of dips, particularly when we come into master bus compression, auto will take care of everything. So if it sees a point where it drops below the threshold, the release will automatically switch off or engage itself, so to speak, because the release is actually a value or a rate. And when it goes above that threshold, the attack gets instigated again. It's just a case of switch on, switch off, switch on, switch off. This determines what we're going to do in terms of gain compensation. You saw in the last video how much the audio had been compressed and what it dropped by in terms of level. Well, we need to bring it back up again. The old technique is to match the output level to the incoming audio. In other words, if the audio comes in and we compress by 4 to 1 about, oh God knows, over minus 30, and we get the 1 dB coming out, blah, 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 we've got to push this back out to get the 4 dB value referenced against the input. Easiest way to explain that is just try and balance your levels going in and out. Auto takes care of that. I think in complex material, auto is wonderful. In other cases, I just prefer to manually set it myself. This is actually to be able to mix using this compressor in parallel mode, which means we allow the dry signal to run through at the same time as the compressed signal. So they're mixed together. We decide by what we want to mix the two signals by. This displays our knee behavior. That is a soft knee. You can see how gentle that curve is. And that knee is how the compressor behaves once the threshold is reached. But strangely enough, with a soft knee, you can see here, we actually start compressing before the threshold is achieved. Sounds crazy, but that's how it works. If I flip this into hard knee, you can see what happens here. Hard knee basically means that once you get here to the threshold, it's an instant compression. Even if your release is set later, the actual compression when it starts will be hard knee. So it will be instant. This is far more gentler. I tend to use hard knees for things like drums, things that have very sharp and quick transients or short duration sounds. I might use soft knee for vocals, but again, I'm just giving you examples. It will vary from material to material. All a sidechain is, really, is an external input, so it could come from any one of your other channels. And I'm sure you've heard the pumping on basses on EDM tracks. And the problem we have with EDM tracks is what? When the kick is playing at the same time as the bass, how do we separate the two? So what we do is we run the kick into the sidechain and compress the bass. I'm doing drums here because I'm going to show you static examples. But in terms of a sidechain, it's a signal that comes into the compressor and takes over the triggering of the compressor. Basically, what that means is now, instead of your threshold triggering the compressor, because remember, we had to achieve the threshold before the compression kicked in, we can now do it with the sidechain. So our kick will determine how we compress the bass. When you leave it on internal mode, you're actually filtering within the architecture of the compressor. Don't worry about that for now. We'll look at that later. External is when we want to use the example I just gave, using, say, a kick to modulate the bass. So we're, in effect, using a process we call ducking. So the kick sounds, and that cuts through, and it just gently compresses the bass. And when the kick stops playing, the bass jumps back up again. What is the filter section for the external sidechain? Let's say we have a kick drum that's going to now compress our bass or duck it. And the part of the kick drum that we want to affect the bass is the body of the kick drum. Maybe we don't want the attack of that kick. Well, let's just use the frequencies of that kick. So I could actually just use 200 Hertz, let's say, which will take away some of the attack of the kick, or I could just leave the full frequency spectrum, or I could tighten it in. So only 51 Hertz of that kick that's coming through is going to trigger this. All the rest of it won't. You'll begin to understand all of these when we start to use them in the techniques videos later. Audition is simply a way of soloing the filter here. In other words, in the example of the kick and the bass, when I audition, we'd be hearing the kick coming in, and we can select the frequency spectrum, or rather bandwidth of the kick. I was selecting a frequency that we want to trigger this compressor. Don't worry about the MIDI Learn Enable section. So what happens here? It's just a display. If I play the audio, I can display what I want shown. Gain reduction, the output value, the input value. It's purely a display mechanism. If I do that, you'll see it grays out. It's just to customize so you can see all the peak transients coming in. Let's go to the PSP. The bus compressor. I love this compressor. Right. What have we got here? We've got the attack again, a release. Don't worry about the filter section. That's a little advanced, and we'll come on to that in later videos. Release, again, as you saw in the Pro C, we could throw it in auto mode, so our release is automatically adjusted. Ratio, we spoke about that. The dry amount and the compressed amount. This is for parallel mode. If you click it in out, you disengage parallel mode, and you're only dealing with the compressed signal. If you put that out and put that in, all you've got is the dry signal going in. If you bring both of them in, you can now mix to taste. This is called parallel mode. In effect, running a dry signal against a compressed signal. Beautifully tells you here. I love VUs. This shows us how much gain reduction there is. And with that, makeup gain is gain compensation. Why not work this drum beat using the bus compressor? All right. The first trick is to set our threshold. I've selected minus 12 dBs here. You can see what's happening. Our VU's bouncing away nice and happily. Let's pick a ratio. Let's say we leave it at 3:1. Put that on instant. Let's switch auto on. If we look at the levels of the compressed signal and the uncompressed signal, which I'm going to do now, but first let me take the dry out. What you're hearing now is the compressed signal. And because we're on 0, we've applied no gain compensation. So it's very, very quiet. You can see it here. if I disengage the compressor and we look at the value here, -11. If I switch this on, our value now is -26. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to compensate to bring it back up. So now we have a healthy signal. It's showing us what is being compressed and where and by how much. If I increase the ratio, can you see what happened here? We got some real extremes taking place. If I go, well, on this one it's 10:1, but if I go 10:1 and beyond, usually it's 20:1 or 40:1. We're into the world of limiting. So that's heavy compression at the moment. I know it's only 4:1, but you can hear how much it's pumping through. If I select the entire audio, you can see what we've done now. We're trying to compress almost the entire audio. Whenever I'm on a mix bus, I'm working in very small values like this. I'm only trying to jump up and down a couple of dBs here and there. So what happens if I now take my attack up? Did you hear how the drums just cut through more? Listen again, I won't talk so you can hear it. And what's happening is exactly what we showed here. Here. We have a signal that's coming through, not getting compressed, even though it's hit the threshold, because the attack is so late. So the compression is taking place later, even though we've reached the threshold. Now let's do the same thing on the Pro C. And let's show you, in fact, let's pick the hard knee, we're talking drums here, you can see the effect. This is the audio that's pumping through once compressed. So you can see that the knee is actually very dramatic. In some instances, you can actually shape the knee. If I pick a higher release value, watch what happens to the transients here and the gain reduction. Can you see? So leaving it on auto sometimes resolves a lot of problems. Gain reduction is shown here. That's how much we've compressed by. To then accommodate that, I need to do this. Remember how we spoke earlier about bringing our levels back up? That's what we do here. That's the gain compensation tool. Input, up to you. I always say get a healthy signal in, but leave some headroom. Let me explain to you what's going on here. Gain reduction, input value, so I can highlight that so we can really see the input. That's my input coming in. That's my compressed signal, so that's the output. Look, that's been compressed. That's my gain reduction up here. And now you can see what I'm doing on the output. As I raise the output here, they jump right up to the gain reduction values. Of course, you've got to try and line the peaks and the troughs perfectly to get that. You could even do this. I just like to do it manually, but on something like a drum beat like this, I'll always throw the auto in. So we now have automatic gain compensation. The knee behavior can actually be heard. It's so dramatic. And if I change the soft knee, it's much smoother. And you can actually hear that smoothness. In terms of behavior of the compressor, FabFilter use style. So you've got classic, opto, and clean. I've left it on clean so we can just hear what we're doing and not have any crazy stuff happening. I'm not after anything minimum phase or whatever. I just want the basic compressor parameters to be covered. And that's really it. So let's run this audio now and compress it. Now let me show you the difference between the two. So what we want to do now is to export this rendered with the compressor. We need to also be very careful when we're exporting. Remember, this is a mono track and we're exporting right now as stereo. So why not just do mono there? So we have a mono audio file that we can import back in, so I can show you what's going on. Lovely. Let's create a quick audio track. I'm doing this via menu options so you can follow it. Let's just import what we processed. There you go. Look at the differences between these two. Compressed, uncompressed. Peaks, fattened. This is our compressed signal. Huge difference. Let's try another compressor. I'm going to use Cubase's one in this example. Okay. Same thing here. Input. That's our output. Minus 8.4, minus 9.3. Now, let's start working. You can see how much gain reduction I have here. I haven't even started to play around. We're on a soft knee. You can see the soft knee behavior. If I switch that off, that becomes a hard knee. Can you see? That's why you get this amazingly harsh hitting response from the compressor. Makeup is at the moment auto, so it's trying to gain compensate. If I switch it off, you can see how much compression has been applied just by using close to 4.5 to 1 with a slow release, or rather, let's put it on auto. Peak to RMS, let's leave it on peak. We'll look at RMS later. For now, let's look at peak. Look at how much compression is taking place because I've set the threshold very low. This is kind of normal level. So what's happening here? Can you see the output value here and the input value? Well, let's match them. We nearly matched them. This is called gain compensation. And you hear the kicks attack coming through. Release is on auto, but what happens if I bring the release right down? Gorgeous. And if I bring the threshold down, I've abated the kick and extended the snare. Now it's both. If I want the compressor to behave intelligently, I compress the whole signal instead of doing this crazy shit. With a very long release, sometimes on fast acting material, the compressor hasn't got enough time to go back to the attack because the release is set too long. So stick it on auto or pick something sensible. Finally, I'm going to look at the SSL bus compressor. This thing is legendary. Absolutely legendary. So simple to use that even I could use it. But what is it? It's the beauty, the sound of this damn thing. It just sounds gorgeous. Let's play it. And really, I tend to use this more on the master bus than anywhere else. Sometimes with vocals, with a de-esser thrown in before it. It's so smooth. Let's try it. So let's go to say minus 20. You can see all the activity going. Yeah, I haven't applied any makeup gain yet or gain compensation. Not until we've played around with these. You can see that SSL selected 2 to 1, 4 to 1 and 20 to 1. 20 to 1 really gets into sort of world of limiting. On my master bus, I always like to stick to about 2 to 1. And here, sometimes I'll just move it a little bit, just to let some attack transients come through. Release can be on auto, or you can shape it yourself. You can see what we did there. We got the pumping action going. If I gain compensate now, you can see how smooth sounding this is. It's utterly gorgeous. Never think that the simplest plugins are the ones that don't have the best features. This is sheer quality. That's it for now. In the next tutorial, we'll cover the different types of compressors before we start using side chains and more advanced techniques. Thank you.